Hello and welcome back to Miss Hannah Loves Grammar. In this video we're examining Rebecca by Daphne Du Maurier, considering context, themes and literary methods. Please like this video, please comment on this video considering your own critical reflections on this text, and of course if you haven't already, please join our tribe and hit subscribe for all things English, literary and grammatical. I'm handing over to the brilliant Miss Boyd. Over to you, Miss.
We're going to start by looking at just a quick plot summary. Now, I'm sure as I'm talking you through this, you'll notice a lot of similarities between the plot of Rebecca and the plot of The Bloody Chamber. Rebecca, in many ways, follows the plot structure of a traditional Gothic or even a noir novel where there's some sense of mystery that needs to be unravelled. So essentially, a young and naive girl agrees to marry a wealthy older man. They move into the countryside together to his isolated, stately home, where she starts to feel haunted by the knowledge of his first wife, Rebecca, before finding out the deadly truth that she was murdered by her husband. It's important to remember we never actually meet Rebecca, but she is constantly haunting the novel through her clothing, through the servants' references to her, and through the objects that she has left in the home. Let's talk about the socio-historical and biographical context of this novel. It was written by Daphne Du Maurier, who is pictured there in the top right, and was published in 1938. Crucially, there are some ways in which this text mirrors elements of Daphne du Maurier's life, and one of those is a person named Jan Ricardo. Jan Ricardo was Daphne du Maurier's husband's fiancée before they married, and she was actually driven to suicide. So there's a question there about how much that mirrors Rebecca's death. At the end, when Rebecca is taunting Maxim, is she trying to push him to kill her because she's too afraid to take her own life? I've also pictured down there in the bottom right a place called Menabilly, and this is where Du Maurier and her husband spent a lot of their time and where they lived in Cornwall. Now you can see easily the similarities between this and Manderley. And it's also important to note that Du Maurier often felt kind of weighed down by domesticity. That would carry different expectations for her as a woman than it would do for her husband, and she often found the pressures of domesticity, the pressures of the home, quite oppressive as a female writer. And something that's important to remember about British society at this time in the 1930s is that there is still a very rigid class system in the UK. Now, this is starting to loosen and it's starting to develop a bit more and become more progressive. A site of modernity in the 1930s was London. That's where people's relationships were changing to each other. That's where some people were developing freer ways of living and freer ways of being. London, however, in this novel, it actually appears quite frightful. The characters who travel regularly between Manderley and London are Rebecca and Jack, and they are definitely threatening to the peace, to the prosperity, and to the status quo at Manderley. So a question to ask yourself as you read and reread this novel is Daphne du Maurier being conservative about the class system? Remember as well that Daphne du Maurier herself was from a very wealthy family. She is definitely not coming from the working classes. She is well established in the upper middle class. It's also really important to look at Rebecca in the context of the Gothic, and this is another really good comparison point with Angela Carter. So as mentioned, this was published in the 1930s. Now, as a bit of literary context, the 1930s marked quite a lot of innovation when it came to literature. This is a period of what was known as modernism, where ideas about what literature should look like and what literature could and should do were changing. And at this time, in this decade, there are quite a lot of more experimental writers being published. So examples of those might include Virginia Woolf, Franz Kafka and Ernest Hemingway. Daphne du Maurier is very much not in that tradition. She is not looking at modernism here. She's going back to a traditional form of the Gothic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk you through 5 key features of the Gothic and how we can see that this is relevant to the text. So something that Gothic novels always have is a really disturbing atmosphere. And we've obviously got that throughout. A very carefully described setting I'm not going to go through any quotes for this just now because we're going to talk about Manderley in more detail later, but we definitely have a sense that Manderley is a character in its own right in this setting. Now, there's also a very strong sense of the uncanny in this novel, and there's two main places that we can look for this. So, one is the depiction of Mrs Danvers. In chapter 18, Mrs Danvers is described as having a skull's face, but this is actually an image that Du Maurier repeats many, many times throughout. There's an uncanny slippage here with Mrs Danvers between an actual human being and some sort of Gothic representation of Rebecca and a reminder of death. The other sense where we have a strong sense of the uncanny is this almost doppelganger effect that we have between Rebecca and the protagonist. And again in chapter 18, she says, "Perhaps I haunted her as she haunted me." We really feel that she is constantly feeling haunted and inhabited by Rebecca. Her flowers still fill the rooms, her objects still fill the rooms. Everything the protagonist does is compared by one of many servants to something that Rebecca did. She is irretrievably linked to this character. And in chapter 16, there's quite a telling moment when Maxim asks her what she'd been thinking about, and she says to herself, "I had so identified myself with Rebecca that my own dull self did not exist, had never come to Manderley." So we've got a really strong sense she is yearning to be like Rebecca. Now, one of the reasons why authors choose to use the Gothic genre is because it allows an exploration of very deep psychological states. In this novel, we feel the horror of a young woman as she adjusts to domesticity. We feel the horror and the unease of this young woman as she adjusts to life as a married woman in an upper class family, in comparison to a relatively free young woman living abroad. Du Maurier herself recognised this work as an example of what she called a study in jealousy. And we have that intense jealousy of Rebecca that carries throughout, and also that intense jealousy that Mrs Danvers feels for the protagonist. Before we look at our literary methods, we're going to do a very quick overview of three key themes of this text. One of these themes is the idea of gender and the performance of femininity. Now, what I mean by that is the different ways that someone can act the role of a woman. And we definitely have this sense the protagonist feels really inadequate in the role that she's playing. There are several references to this idea of gaucherie, for example, in chapter 1 throughout. If you're gauche, it means you're kind of awkward and unsophisticated. And she explicitly describes herself as an awkward figure. So we can tell she feels really uncomfortable in this role of the upper class woman that she's playing. And we've got an obvious contrast here with the awe that she sees in Rebecca, for her beauty, her charm, and her breeding, which of course she then realises to be superficial. There's quite an interesting link here to Du Maurier's own biography. Du Maurier as a child didn't really like acting in the ways that girls then would be expected to act. She often preferred to dress up as a boy and act like a boy, and even gave that alter ego a name of Eric Avon. Another key theme in this text is rivalry and mirroring. We've got an obvious sense of rivalry between the protagonist and Rebecca herself, and we can see that in those quotes above. She constantly feels like she's being compared to Rebecca, and she of course compares herself to Rebecca as well. But we also have a sense of this kind of rivalry between the protagonist and Mrs Danvers for control of the house. And finally, another really important theme in this is repressed sexuality. So we can see this in lots of different ways. There are quite a few hints at the sort of sexlessness of Maxim and the protagonist's marriage. For example, at the beginning of chapter 12, when she remarks that she'd bought some new underwear, she said it seemed such a waste buying new underclothes for Clarice. So we've got a hint that they are not physically intimate, and in fact we don't actually see them being intimate together until she's found out about the murder. If you look at the way that Mrs Danvers handles some of Rebecca's belongings, there's definitely a sense of kind of fetishization and a sexual obsession there. And there are also some coded references to what could be interpreted as bisexuality in the character of Rebecca. Maxim talks about some of the things that she does in London being unspeakable and disgusting. It's not too far of a stretch to read those as references to sexual relationships with other women. So the first method that we're going to talk about is the narrative structure. And the reason we're talking about this is because it is not strictly chronological. So it opens with a dream of Manderley. We've got the gnarled roots like skeleton claws, and she talks about the poor thread of the path as she approaches the house. So straight away we've got this kind of Gothic setting, we've got this sense of dread being created. And this description of the poor thread of the path is going to mirror the ways that she struggles to understand Manderley when she's there. In chapter 2, we've got quite a sudden cut to the present day, and this is again where we've got more of a sense of mystery introduced. So we start with the mystery of Manderley, and then in chapter 2, we've got the mystery of who is he. We know that she has somehow escaped and she is in Europe with a man, but as we read, the question is going to be, who is this man? There are arguments to suggest it could be Maxim, and perhaps there are also arguments to suggest that at points it could be Frank. The majority of the narrative, therefore, is her recounting the past. So it's quite similar to the Bloody Chamber in that sense, that we've got this more experienced narrator looking back on a more girlish kind of part of her life. So the question we have to think about is, where does the tension come from? Part of this comes from this unfolding mystery as we as readers are desperate to find out what happens to Rebecca. And part of it is to see, will she assimilate into Manderley? Will she be able to be the mistress of the house? And it ends quite suddenly with the destruction of Manderley, in quite a moving final sentence when Du Maurier writes that the ashes blew towards us with salt wind from the sea. This is quite an ambiguous ending, which, as I've mentioned before, is a really good comparison point. Could this be a final act of revenge from Rebecca beyond the grave? We know that Rebecca's often been associated with the sea, so here it's almost like she's taunting them. We have this ambiguity of how it's set on fire. Was it Mrs Danvers? Was it an accident? Is there a sense of bitterness and mourning with the destruction of Manderley? Or does this actually create a sense of hope and freedom for their relationship, as we know that they're going to go on and they're going to continue to be together? So as mentioned, this is written in the first person past tense. This is a woman's account of her own story after she has survived her ordeal. And as discussed earlier, the narrator is purposefully depicting a girlish version of herself. For example, she talks a lot about that gaucherie, she talks about feeling uncomfortable in the clothes that she's wearing. And this naivety is really important because it amplifies the sense of horror that she feels, for example, when faced with characters like Mrs Danvers there in the top right. But we also have this sense of mystery. Because of her naivety, even though she is trying, it takes her a long time to really understand the world around her. And she describes in chapter 11 this frightened, furtive seed of curiosity that grows slowly and stealthily. So because of her young naivety, it's almost like she's taking on the role of a detective in a noir narrative and trying to discover who Rebecca is and what happened to her. And through her naivety, we take on that mystery as well. Another important thing to note about this narrator is she's got a really strong propensity to daydream. Pages upon pages of this novel are just really actually fantasies and daydreams of her rather than reality. And we see this straight away in chapter 3 when she first meets Maxim. And he makes her think of men in medieval paintings, a past where men walked cloaked at night and stood in the shadow of old doorways. So even before she started her relationship with him, even before she's gone to Manderley, she's already got this quite Gothic understanding and Gothic imagination of the world. Now this narrator, in all her kind of Gothic potential, in all her naivety, she allows us to experience really deep psychological states, whether that's horror and a growing sense of dread in a world where you don't feel like you belong, or that intense jealousy, remembering that Du Maurier herself described this text as a study in jealousy. And there's a question here. As you know, this protagonist is never named. Does this allow us as readers to embody those psychological states more deeply? As discussed earlier, Gothic novels are characterised by this really disturbing setting, and the Gothic setting of Manderley definitely looms large throughout the entirety of this novel. It's important to note this novel both begins and ends with quite a deathly and frightening description of this setting, and it's almost personified as a character in its own right. There's a constant tension running through this novel, where sometimes Manderley is seen as an almost Eden-like paradise, and at other times it's hellish and nightmarish. So let's look at an example of each. In the opening description, there's some excellent personification of the forests round about Manderley, and they're definitely seen as gothic, as sinister, as frightening, and as deadly. In chapter 7 as well, the drive itself is described as twisting and turning as a serpent. Serpents obviously carry quite traditional connotations of betrayal from the Garden of Eden, and that idea of it twisting and turning also mirrors the way the narrator really fails to kind of place herself in Manderley and to fully understand it. But Manderley isn't only frightening, it can also be very beautiful, and we've got that description of the happy valley there in chapter 10. That's a moment when Manderley is associated with beauty, with nature, and with abundance. And there's an interesting link, I think, to be made here between the protagonist's inability to understand Manderley and also the narrative perspective. So, for example, when describing Manderley, she says there is no sense or beauty in this undergrowth. And it's almost as if her inability to understand Manderley matches her feelings of feeling lost in this new social and feminine role that she's found herself in. Rebecca herself is an incredibly important motif in this novel, and it's also very important that we remember we never meet her physically as a living being. We only find her in potentially the most vulnerable state we could find her, as a body in the boat that has been sunk. But despite the fact of her absence, the constant mentions of her by the servants, by the guests, and the constant fantasies of the protagonist create Rebecca as really a force of oppression and a force of fear for our protagonist. As discussed earlier, the protagonist seems to view her as an ideal of femininity. She describes her charm and her breeding, and this serves to accentuate her own feelings of inadequacy and inexperience, both in terms of this new kind of feminine role as a wife she has to play, but also her entry into this whole other social class. We can also look at the relationships with Danny or Mrs Danvers and Rebecca and explore this in terms of that theme of sexual repression. Mrs Danvers has quite an uncomfortable relationship with Rebecca. In some ways, she's almost like a mother to her. She's been with her since she was a child. But in others, we definitely get this sense that her obsession with Rebecca has a sexual or an erotic element to it. We see the way she handles the objects in her bedroom, and she also becomes very indignant against some of the accusations made against Rebecca at the end. She said she despised all men, she was above all that. It's quite shocking, based on all we've heard about Rebecca from the other characters, when we find out the truth about her at the end. She is sexually promiscuous, potentially queer. We get that from Danny's lines there, and also some of the things Maxim mentions about how kind of disgusting or unspeakable what she had done was. But she is also dying. So despite this immense depiction of her power, we realise actually at her moment of death, she was incredibly vulnerable. Now, to modern readers in the 21st century, the ending of this novel can feel a bit problematic, and there's a question here about whether Rebecca is actually being punished by Du Maurier for being a sexually promiscuous woman. Through the perspective of the narrator, and the narrator's intense relief and her newfound closeness with Maxim after the revelation of the murder, it really does feel like Du Maurier is pushing us to feel sympathetic with the narrator and with Maxim, rather than feeling any sense of horror at the fact that this woman has been murdered just for being adulterous. I'm going to leave you now with two critical quotations. One is from Olivia Laing, who talks about the emotional landscapes of the novel and the presentation of desire. And one is from a woman called Laura Varnum, who talks about how it's Maxim really who we should see as the most dangerous character, not Rebecca. It's up to you to read these in more detail, decide, do you agree with these critics? What evidence can you find of this in the text? And what evidence can you find to challenge these? Whenever you're including your critics, remember you're always thinking about how you can make what they are saying support your own argument.